"What do you think you are hiding in this black bag?" Officer Kane said through clenched teeth as his rough hand yanked Naomi's arm in front of the stunned crowd. Without a reason, he shoved her onto the cold concrete, his face twisted with contempt. "People like you always bring trouble to this neighborhood." Naomi gritted her teeth, her breath tight, but her eyes did not waver. Kane leaned down, ripped the black bag from her, and tried to imagine a crime to pin on her. But everything shifted only a few seconds later. A glowing signal lit up from beneath Naomi's clothing. Kane froze, his lips twitching with fear. Naomi looked straight at him and spoke slowly and clearly. "You are making a mistake, and you do not have much time left to fix it." The bitter truth was closing in. He had just laid hands on a high-ranking SEAL operator. That signal had already been sent, and the kind of force he never wanted to face was coming directly for him. So if you were Kane, what would you do when you realized the person you insulted and assaulted was someone who could bring your entire system crashing down? Would you keep abusing your authority or bow your head before everything spun out of control? And if you feel outraged by this injustice, hit subscribe, comment justice for Naomi, and help push this truth even further. The afternoon settled over the neighborhood in a cold, gray light, a faint layer that felt like a thin veil draped across every rooftop and made the whole street quieter than usual. Liam Carter parked his delivery van in front of Naomi Brooks's house. A chill rose from the trunk as he opened it to retrieve a black bag, the kind of bag that might look suspicious to anyone passing by, though to Liam it was only one of the many packages he had to deliver that day. He walked toward the porch where Naomi waited with the calm demeanor of someone used to receiving specialized equipment for her work. Liam's footsteps landed softly on the damp concrete, and when he handed the black bag to Naomi, neither of them knew that this seemingly ordinary exchange would unintentionally become the spark that pulled them into a whirlwind of trouble no one could have predicted. Naomi took the bag and nodded in thanks, her eyes checking it as if looking for signs of damage. Liam was about to head back to his van when an unusual sound reached him, low and drawn out, before stopping right at the gate, the brakes of a patrol car. Both he and Naomi instinctively looked over and saw the blue and white police cruiser pulling up to the curb. Kane, whose eyes always hunted for the smallest suspicious movement, caught sight of Liam handing Naomi the black bag. In that instant, he did not see a delivery worker doing his job or a black woman receiving a package like anyone else. Instead, in his mind, that simple handoff twisted into something criminal, a transaction he projected with meanings born only from his own prejudice. Kane swung his door open and strode over so quickly that it startled Liam. He wasted no time observing or asking questions as the procedure required. He stopped right in front of Naomi, and his commanding voice cut through the air like an order meant to erase any normalcy from the situation. "What did you just receive? What's in the bag? You know I can see everything clearly, right?" His tone was drawn out, not explosive with anger, but the kind that made anyone feel as if they had been placed under an interrogation lamp, even though they were simply standing on a porch after a routine delivery. Naomi frowned slightly, unable to understand why a simple package drop-off had turned into a reason for a police officer to confront her. Keeping her voice steady, she explained that it was just a delivery, sent to the correct address, fully legal. But Kane had no intention of listening. His attention stayed locked on the black bag, as if it held a secret only he had the authority to expose and define. He stepped closer, his stare openly accusatory. "You're hiding something connected to a murder case, aren't you? A black bag, a secret exchange, suspicious behavior. I see enough signs already." Liam stood nearby, his face draining of color as he was dragged into something far beyond his role as a delivery worker. He tried to speak up, saying he was the legitimate courier, that he had the digital receipt, and that it was nothing more than a standard shipment. He even unlocked his phone to open the app and show the order details. but Kane did not look. He seemed to be waiting for any excuse to push Naomi into the guilt he had already imagined. "You step aside. You are not the issue. She is." Kane said, his voice thick with dismissal. Those words told Naomi exactly what he intended. The authority he carried seemed to give him the confidence to judge anyone, especially when the person in front of him was a black woman receiving a black bag. He needed no evidence, no reasoning, no justification beyond the prejudice rooted so deeply that he assumed Naomi had to be involved in something suspicious. The brief silence between them grew heavy. One look at Kane's eyes was enough for Naomi to know he had labeled her a suspect the moment he pulled up. Liam stepped back, but the worry stayed in his eyes. He had never seen an officer become so agitated over something so ordinary. He looked at Naomi, then at Kane, feeling the tension spreading through every breath. Naomi stood straight, steady, but she understood that from the instant the patrol car stopped at the curb, nothing was simple anymore. She did not know that only minutes later, this small moment would become the trigger for a fierce chain of confrontations involving residents, social media, and even the military. Kane did not back off. He stared at Naomi, narrowing his eyes as if trying to read things she had not said. He questioned her again, his voice lower, but even heavier. "Do you really think I am going to believe your explanation? This bag looks too suspicious, and I do not like the way you look at me like you do not owe me an answer." Naomi inhaled slowly, trying to keep calm, and replied that she was hiding nothing. But at that moment, Kane reached out to touch the bag without asking permission or giving notice. He believed that placing suspicion on someone gave him authority over everything connected to that person. Liam stepped forward again, trying to say he was the only one authorized to check the bag before delivery and that Kane should not touch it without permission. But Kane snapped around his eyes sharp enough to stop Liam mid-step. "I told you, stand back," Kane repeated, his voice harder than before. Naomi said nothing more, but she felt the injustice settling in. Kane saw her as guilty simply because she stood before him with a skin color he did not want to see. The moment did not last long, but it was enough to erase every trace of normalcy from the quiet afternoon. On that still street, a confrontation had already taken shape. Kane had opened a door to trouble he himself could not foresee. Naomi stayed where she was, her hand gripping the bag tightly, unaware that in only a few moments what happened today would shake the neighborhood, unsettle the police department, ignite social media, and draw in the military. She knew only one thing: this encounter was not a misunderstanding, but a collision between prejudice and dignity, between authority and truth, between what Kane believed he was protecting and what Naomi was forced to defend for herself. The tense moment on the porch had not eased when two more officers stepped out from behind the patrol car. The sharp sound of the doors slamming shut cut through the dim afternoon, making Naomi feel her breath grow heavier. They moved toward her with the posture of people approaching a dangerous suspect. Their eyes swept over her, then over the black bag Kane had been staring at, their hostility clearer than any words they had not yet spoken. No one asked if she was all right. No one asked what had happened. For them, seeing Kane standing in front of a black woman holding a dark-colored bag was enough to construct a full suspect in their minds. Naomi held back any attempt to explain because she could already see that nothing in their attitude invited understanding. The watchful eyes of all three officers tracked her every small movement, as if she were about to do something they were eager to interpret as resistance. Liam sensed the shift immediately. He stepped toward the side of the yard, trying not to draw more attention, but his worried gaze stayed fixed on Naomi. For a moment, the arrival of the two officers made the atmosphere much heavier, as if all the remaining daylight had been pulled toward where Naomi stood. Kane folded his arms and tilted his head at Naomi, as if he already knew every answer he wanted to hear. "What are you trying to hide in that bag? That nervous move you made earlier earlier makes me wonder what you do not want us to see," he said, his tone firm and final, more like a conclusion than a question. The two officers beside him immediately added their own overly serious remarks as if stepping onto a crime scene. "People like this usually hide things in bags like that," one said, glancing at the bag while throwing Naomi a mocking look. Naomi tightened her grip on the bag, not out of fear or hesitation, but because being pushed into a corner so blatantly made something cold settle inside her. "This is a package delivered to me properly. There is nothing suspicious," she said, each word steady, though weighed down by repeated insult. The comments from the three officers, especially Kane, carried not only prejudice, but the certainty of accusations they had brought with them without evidence, without thought. Kane stepped forward, his eyes showing a kind of satisfaction at Naomi being forced to defend herself. It pushed him to increase his accusatory tone. "Innocent people do not defend themselves this much. You are making everything look suspicious." Naomi looked straight at him. "I am defending myself because you are accusing me of something I did not do," she said, her voice controlled. It was a firm rejection, but Kane interpreted it as defiance. He let out a thin laugh, speaking as if her words confirmed his assumption. "Trying to hide evidence when caught is a common reaction for people doing something shady." He said, his eyes still locked on the black bag. Liam stood beside her, unable to bear the absurdity. "He is completely wrong," he murmured, as if reminding himself, but also trying to encourage Naomi. He wanted to step forward, but Kane shot him a warning glare that forced Liam to swallow his frustration. The two other officers stayed aligned with Kane, nodding at every accusation as if they had witnessed Naomi do something they had never actually seen. While Naomi tried to maintain her composure, a few nearby residents began to stop and watch. At first it was only curious glances, but when they saw Kane standing too close to Naomi and pointing repeatedly at the bag, their curiosity shifted to concern. A couple walking their dog came to a full stop. A young mother stood in the yard across the street, halfway inside her doorway, but unable to look away. Two teenagers under a tree slowed their steps, their hands drifting to the pockets where their phones were kept. Then, the sound of a camera app opening cut through the air. One phone rose, then a second, then a third. The bystanders seemed to understand that what they were watching was not normal. Naomi realized it too, and although the attention made her more tense, each gaze felt like a piece of fairness she had been lacking. Kane heard the recording begin. He tilted his head and the corner of his mouth lifting into a cold smile. He did not look bothered. If anything, he seemed eager to show everyone that he was the one in control of this street. He glanced at the people holding their phones, then turned back to Naomi with an even more provoking attitude. "You should remember," he said, lowering his voice, but loud enough for all to hear, "everything that happens here is decided by me." Those words were not a warning, but a declaration of power. And because he knew he was being filmed, Kane pushed harder with every word and gesture. In his eyes, it was no longer about suspicion or a black bag, but about claiming dominance in front of a crowd. Naomi could feel it. Every look he gave, every breath he took showed he was trying to assert superiority by forcing her into the lowest position possible. She drew in a deep breath. She knew she had to stay clear-headed because any hasty reaction would be labeled resistance or dangerous behavior. The thick air made her feel like every movement was under scrutiny. The steady disrespect from Kane and the two officers felt like invisible restraints tightening around her, but her eyes stayed firm as if telling them she was not someone they could crush with prejudice. The crowd began murmuring. One person whispered that the officers were going too far, and another suspected Kane was picking a fight because she was a black woman. A few people stepped closer, not interfering but standing near enough to record every officer's face clearly. The phones pointed at Kane were no longer capturing curiosity. They had become evidence of what was happening. The entire street grew strangely quiet. No cars passing, no neighbors talking, only the soft rustling of leaves and the pounding of Naomi's heartbeat, reminding her she had to stay steady under all the eyes and accusations aimed at her. A difficult feeling rose inside her as she realized that although she had done nothing wrong, prejudice had already placed her in a position where she was expected to prove her innocence to people who needed no reason to doubt her. Naomi looked at Kane, then at the two officers lined up behind him. All of them believed they had the authority to dismiss anything she said regardless of the truth. Kane leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the bag like a predator searching for weakness. "Do you know," he said slowly, "that traces of crime often hide in the most ordinary places?" The sentence washed another layer of cold over her. Even though she had nothing to hide, his tone made it clear he was not looking for truth, but for a pretext to act as he pleased. People held their breath as Kane reached toward Naomi's bag, every eye following each inch of his movement. No one knew what would happen next, but the recording of this moment might push everything far beyond this small neighborhood. Naomi tightened her grip, not to conceal anything, but to protect her dignity from someone trying to distort it. And in that moment, in the thick air and under the watchful crowd, Naomi felt a certainty that everything was approaching a turning point much larger than the accusations Kane had thrown at her. One more move from him and the rest of her life would shift into an entirely different chapter. The air around Naomi's porch grew heavier by the minute. The eyes of the neighbors, the cold, scrutinizing stares of the three officers, and Naomi's own tight breaths seemed to weave together into a layer of pressure. Kane stood close in front of her, his face hardened with the determination to assert his authority over the situation. He stared at the bag as if it held every answer he wanted to force into existence. Naomi had no time to think about what he might do next before Kane suddenly stepped forward, grabbed her shoulders with both hands, and shoved her hard onto the cold concrete. The violent, unnecessary force knocked her off balance. She hit the ground, her hand slamming against it with a sharp, dry sound. A gasp broke from the nearest bystanders, and shock rippled into murmurs as people watched Kane use far more aggression than anything the moment called for. Naomi felt the freezing pavement press into her body, but before she could push herself up, another officer dropped to one knee, his full weight driving into her back and crushing her breath. The pressure on her spine shot pain through her ribs, and her arm was yanked behind her with no restraint in the force. Even though her body was completely limp, offering no resistance, the officer handled her as if restraining a dangerous criminal. Naomi's breathing fractured each attempt to draw air, feeling like it had to squeeze through a narrow crack. She fought to keep her breath steady, her mind clear, trying not to let the pain or fear overwhelm the calm she had learned to maintain through far harsher environments. Yet, even with her training being pinned down under the weight of prejudice and authority, surrounded by people misusing the law sent a wave of humiliation through her that words could barely hold. Liam froze in shock at the sight. His face drained his eyes wide as Naomi was forced to the ground. He stepped forward instinctively, his voice shaking. "What are you doing?" "She did nothing wrong," but Kane cut him off with a shout, his voice sharp like a command barked at a subordinate. "Step back now. This is an active investigation. One more step and you will be arrested for interfering with law enforcement." The aggression in his tone made Liam stop, but the fury inside him only rose higher. He stepped back, but his gaze stayed locked on Naomi, desperate to help without making things worse. In that moment, something struck Liam like a cold blade of realization. This was not a procedure. This was not a lawful detainment. This was abuse, deliberate and intentional, a performance of power built on the vulnerability of its victim. He understood that Naomi had become the center of an attack driven by prejudice, not truth. Kane leaned over Naomi, his footsteps stopping right beside where she lay. Her breathing was heavy, but her eyes still angled toward him. He lowered his head closer, as if making sure she heard every word he was about to say. "Exactly what I thought. People like you only bring trouble to this neighborhood." His voice was cold and laced with contempt, the kind that made the bystanders feel a chill run down their spines. His words were loaded with accusations tangled in race prejudice and self-righteous certainty. Kane did not care about the truth. In his mind, her skin color and the dark bag were enough to justify pinning her to the pavement. Silence settled over the street for a few seconds after that. Then, small murmurs of protest rose from the crowd, first just a few frustrated voices from the people closest. "He's going too far," someone muttered. "She hasn't even done anything," another added. Those voices were sparks, and within seconds the frustration spread. A few people stepped closer, not interfering but standing near enough to record every movement from Kane and the other officers. Phones lifted in the air formed a half-circle, an invisible barrier surrounding Naomi and the ones abusing their authority. Kane heard the objections, but rather than back down, he raised his voice as if daring the crowd to challenge him. "She's hiding something," he said loudly, glancing around so everyone could hear. "I saw her suspicious behavior clearly." As soon as he finished, the officer pinning Naomi pressed harder, forcing a pained breath out of her. She clenched her teeth enduring it, but the blatant violence only fueled the crowd's anger. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew this was far beyond proper procedure. Liam could not hold back any longer. He stepped forward, speaking louder, his voice cracking with anger. "Stop! You're treating her like a criminal without a single valid reason." His words sent a tremor through the tense atmosphere, prompting a few people to voice their agreement. But Kane had no intention of stopping. He shot Liam a sharp, warning glare. "Say one more word and I'll cuff you too." Liam tightened his fists, his whole body tense, but he knew reacting now would only make everything worse. Naomi heard the threats, the angry whispers from the crowd, her own shallow breaths forced out against the pavement, and in that moment she understood how easily power, when placed in the wrong hands, could twist truth within seconds. Kane did not care whether she was innocent. He cared only about proving his dominance in front of the public, and to do that he chose Naomi as the foundation for his crude display of power. He leaned down beside her again, his voice low and deliberately slow so each word would sink into the thick air. "Your skin color says everything," he said, as if reading a conclusion that had been stamped long ago. The remark drew angry outbursts from several people in the crowd. The contempt in his words cut into Naomi's dignity like a blade, yet that same sentence sharpened the eyes of everyone recording, as if they had just witnessed the core of the injustice unfolding. The atmosphere felt ready to crack. Naomi felt the pain in her back, the weight crushing her breath, but she also sensed the rising heat of anger from those around her. Every word from Kane, every unnecessary act of force pushed the situation closer to a line that could not be undone. Once crossed, it would no longer be an incident on one porch, but an issue for an entire community watching abuse carried out under the excuse of law. Naomi closed her eyes for a second to steady her breath, then opened them with the awareness that her endurance would not bring her peace, but her calm presence might bring the truth into the open. Kane stood above her, certain he controlled everything, unaware that each violent move, each hateful word, brought him closer to a dark truth he could never anticipate, a truth for which he would pay dearly. The murmuring of the crowd grew louder, their angry eyes drilling into the abuse unfolding in front of them. Naomi remained on the cold concrete, her back pinned by the officer's knee, while her breath came in strained bursts under the pressure. Kane stood nearby, his face filled with the satisfaction of someone convinced he held absolute authority. He looked at Naomi as if she were someone stripped of the right to resist, then glanced at the filming crowd with the same defiant expression. In his eyes, there was no hesitation or discomfort, only the arrogance of a man who believed he could define right and wrong according to his own prejudice. Kane leaned closer, standing by Naomi's shoulder, and began speaking in a steady but cold voice, the tone of someone telling a story he believed would justify him to everyone watching. "I saw my father get attacked by a black man right on our own porch," he said, his stare seeming to pass through Naomi and into the distorted memory he clung to. "From that day, I knew people like you always bring trouble." His story split the air not because it was convincing, but because of the raw acidity in using a single moment from his past as an invisible sentence placed on Naomi's shoulders. He spoke as though sharing an undeniable truth, but the crowd knew a lone memory could not define a person. Still, Kane continued speaking as if his voice alone could rebuild the world to match his view. "You know," he said, "I've seen plenty of cases like my father's. People like you always find ways to do something shady, from this black bag to those sneaky moves you just made." Naomi heard every word, each one dropping heavy into her ears, but her eyes stayed sharp as she looked toward Kane from where she was pinned down. Despite the difficulty, she did not look away or close her eyes to escape his stare. She understood people like him far too well. People who draped others like her in layers of prejudice, drawn from a twisted experience they had turned into their own private law. In his mind, Naomi was not Naomi. She was a symbol of everything he had heard, seen, feared, and hated. He needed no proof, because in his mind, guilt had already been assigned. Liam stood nearby, hearing every word Kane spoke, and felt his stomach tighten. He realized Kane was not only using his authority, but also using his past to justify everything he was doing. Yet, to the people gathered around, even those who said nothing, it was clear that Kane's story about his father had nothing to do with the cruelty Naomi was enduring. A personal memory could not turn the woman lying on the pavement into a criminal, but Kane spoke as if it could. Naomi kept her gaze steady, looking straight at him without a trace of fear. Inside, she felt the absurdity of every word he said, but she refused to let emotion pull her off balance. "What happened to your father has nothing to do with me," she said slowly, her breath breaking under the pressure on her back, "and I am not the person you are trying to imagine." Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and firm. Kane stared at her for a long moment as if weighing her response, then let out a mocking laugh. "You think I will believe you?" he said. "Look at that bag." He kicked the package hard enough to send it rolling several feet, spinning before it stopped with the zipper facing the crowd. A few people flinched at the act, not because the bag was threatening, but because Kane treated it as if it were real evidence. "That is not a normal delivery," he said loudly, as though trying to force the crowd to agree. "That is evidence, and I will get the truth out of it any way I can." The residents watched the black bag, then looked back at Naomi. They could see clearly that it was not evidence, not a sign of guilt, but a simple package being turned into the centerpiece of a fabricated accusation. Kane's kick was not the behavior of an officer performing his duty, but of a man using prejudice as a weapon, and another person's humiliation as a way to bolster his power. Naomi saw the bag land and felt a flicker of helplessness at seeing something harmless treated like contraband. She knew that once Kane labeled it suspicious, he would twist the truth however he wanted. But she kept her eyes steady, a look that made the nearby onlookers feel both anger and admiration. Pressured and surrounded by prejudice, she remained anchored within herself, as if nothing Kane said could strip away her worth. Kane stepped back slightly to take in the scene he had created. He saw the bag lying there like an object meant to display his authority. He saw Naomi pinned to the ground and believed that this proved her nature in the way he chose to interpret it. But he did not realize that every action he took, every word he spoke, every baseless reason he offered was shifting the crowd from shock to genuine outrage. The eyes around him were no longer just recording. They were watching to remember. Silence stretched for several more seconds, then the air grew heavier. Somewhere within the crowd, a sense of injustice was rising like a tide. Naomi felt the shift. She knew this was the moment when the truth had not yet been spoken, but the lies Kane had built were beginning to unravel in the eyes of those witnessing them. And as her package lay tossed in the middle of the street with Kane standing above it in misplaced confidence, Naomi understood that everything was approaching a breaking point, one whose consequences Kane himself could not possibly foresee. The rustling wind along the street seemed to hesitate at the scene unfolding. Naomi was still pinned to the cold pavement, her breath sharp and uneven under the growing weight on her back. The crowd had thickened phones held high in a curved ring around the area, their eyes shifting between anger and the fear that everything was about to spiral out of control. Kane stood before the bag he had kicked away, his expression a mix of irritation and pride as he felt every gaze fixed on him as if he were performing a role he expected to be applauded. He bent down to pick up the bag, his gloved hand gripping it as though it contained the most important evidence of his career. Without asking, without permission, without any explanation, Kane yanked the zipper open, his movements sharp like he was exposing a crime. The bystanders leaned forward slightly, and Liam took a few small steps closer despite trying not to provoke the situation. When the bag opened, it revealed neatly packed electronic equipment along with standard transport documentation. Kane tore through everything, tossing out each item like a man searching for gold in gravel. But the more he searched, the more hollow he became because nothing resembled the evidence he had invented for Naomi. The air turned strange as Kane froze, standing still for several seconds as he processed the disappointment hitting him. He had found nothing to justify his accusations yet. Instead of accepting reality, he looked from the bag to Naomi with an even harsher suspicion. "Very clever," he said, raising his voice as if the lack of contraband proved her guilt. "The important piece is not here. You already got rid of it." A ripple moved through the crowd. Some people shook their heads, others muttered that the accusation was absurd. Liam stepped closer, his face hot with anger. "What is wrong with you?" he said, loud enough for many to hear while still trying to stay controlled. "There's nothing in there. She received a legal shipment. You are accusing her of nothing." Kane glanced at him with clear impatience but did not respond. Instead, he turned back to Naomi, still forced against the pavement, and spoke in a cold voice. "Where are you hiding it?" he asked, as though she had already confessed. "You think I am too stupid to see through you? People like you always think you can fool the law." Naomi struggled to speak under the pressure on her back, but she still managed her voice, strained yet steady. "I told you it is a legitimate delivery. I have nothing to hide." Kane answered her only with a thin, mocking laugh that made several bystanders frown in anger. Kane straightened up and signaled for the officer beside him to ease the pressure just enough for Naomi to lift her head. But the moment she raised it a few inches off the pavement, he held out a pre-printed form, the corner slightly crumpled from his grip while searching her bag. It was a confession statement, the kind used for suspects who had already admitted to wrongdoing. "Sign this," he ordered. "State that you attempted to dispose of evidence and acted suspiciously when approached." The murmurs in the crowd rose into clear outrage. Someone shouted, "She hasn't done anything. How can you force her to confess?" But Kane ignored everyone. He placed the document in front of Naomi, his eyes cold and threatening. "If you do not sign, every piece of evidence will work against you. The video, the witnesses, our statements. You will not walk away from this." He spoke each word as if her fate sat in his hands, trying to turn fiction into a net he could tighten around her with the authority he believed he possessed. Naomi lifted her gaze to him, her back burned with pain, each breath slicing her lungs. The pressure had made her throat raw, and her hands trembled from how hard she was being restrained. Yet her eyes stayed steady, even sharper from the prolonged insult. She stared directly at Kane's face, the face of a man convinced he was pushing her to the edge. "I will not sign," she said, her voice weak but firm. "I will not incriminate myself to protect what you are doing wrong." Kane clenched his jaw, anger finally breaking through his mask. He looked at Naomi as if she had dared challenge the power he worshipped, then nodded at the officer behind her. The weight on her back increased instantly, forcing the air from her chest. Her arms were gripped tighter, a numbness shooting down to her fingers. But Naomi's eyes did not waver. They stayed on Kane, reflecting the steadiness of someone who knew the truth was on her side even while buried beneath force. Liam could barely stand, seeing Naomi pressed to the point she could not breathe. He shouted fury, tearing through his voice. "Stop! She can't breathe!" Kane snapped toward him, shouting back, "Stay out of this! This is police business." His words only fueled the crowd's anger. More people stepped forward and others yelled for Kane to release Naomi. The phones were no longer just recording tools, but evidence that the community was building against the abuse unfolding before them. Naomi could feel their support even though she could not turn her head to see them. Through Through her pain and steady refusal to yield, she sensed Kane beginning to grow uneasy. He realized the woman pinned beneath him would not bow to his threats, would not sign the document he tried to force on her. That only made him more determined to prove he controlled everything. But Kane did not understand that every move he made was being captured, every word he spoke was being heard, and every abuse he displayed before the crowd would become the very evidence used against him. And Naomi, held down under the weight of humiliation, had become the center of the truth that was about to rise. In Naomi's strangled breaths and in the outrage spreading across the street, a new force was gathering, ready to turn this moment into the spark for a much larger eruption Kane was entirely unprepared to face. The crowd's objections thickened around the scene like layered pressure. Phones were still raised high, murmurs blending into one another as anger and fear grew that Kane had crossed every boundary of lawful conduct. Naomi remained pinned to the pavement, her shoulders throbbing from her arms being pulled tight, her breathing strained as the weight on her back compressed her chest like a closing vise. Each time she tried to draw a full breath, that weight pressed harder, as if trying to push her into the cold cement. Liam stood beside her, his hands clenched so tightly they turned white, unable to bear what he was witnessing. He looked around, seeing the citizens filming, seeing Kane grow increasingly aggressive, seeing the truth twisted into something grotesque. In that chaos, a bystander standing near the line of shrubs brought their phone closer for a tighter shot. They wanted to capture every detail, every movement, every expression from Kane and the other officers to serve as evidence later. As the phone shifted toward Naomi's shoulder, her nameplate came into view under the dim afternoon light. The silver metal letters spelling Brooks reflected a faint glint barely noticeable unless someone was close or looking carefully. The bystander immediately zoomed in, fingers swiping quickly across the screen. A look of curiosity mixed with suspicion crossed their face. Seconds later, a clipped segment showing only the nameplate Brooks was posted online with a brief caption, "Is she military?" The video spread at astonishing speed. Those watching via live stream from the phones of people at the scene began buzzing with speculation. Within minutes, the name Naomi Brooks was being searched across forums, internal information pages, and public military-related accounts. The results surfaced faster than anyone expected. Viewers found an old document listing Naomi Brooks in a special naval training program. No one knew how accurate it was, but in an atmosphere already thick with doubt, that detail became fuel spreading at incredible speed. Within minutes, the same phenomenon appeared across platforms. Comment threads exploded, with some people questioning others, asserting, and others trying to connect every piece to uncover the truth. Rumors surged as an underground wave strong enough that even people standing at the scene began hearing whispers passed from one onlooker to the next. The police are detaining the wrong person. She's Navy. If they're humiliating a service member, this won't end quietly. Those words first carried uncertainty, but as they spread, they grew firmer, faster, and louder. Naomi lay on the pavement, still trying to stay calm while fighting for air. She had no idea that the small nameplate on her chest had begun to shift the perception of everyone watching. But one person was starting to understand what the crowd had only begun to whisper about. Liam listened to the rumors rising around him while looking at Naomi with growing shock. He leaned closer to examine her sleeve, where an insignia shaped as an anchor inside a circle rested something he had overlooked in the chaos. It was the familiar emblem of the United States Navy, a symbol worn openly only by those who had earned special operational status. Liam drew in a breath, a mix of horror and respect hit in him at once. He understood that Naomi was not simply a victim of abuse. She could be a trained military service member, someone police were never allowed to lay hands on without legitimate cause. His mind raced back through everything she had said, her controlled breaths, the sharp steadiness in her eyes while Kane berated her. Suddenly, everything aligned in a way that made his heart pound harder. He stepped forward half a pace, his expression shifting from confusion to resolve as if he had chosen a clear side. "She is not just anyone," he said to the person next to him, and the sentence instantly became another piece, feet in the picture spreading across the crowd. As the rumors grew, Naomi sensed a subtle change in the air. Though she still could not turn her head, she heard questions about her identity rising from multiple directions. Some people whispered her last name, others repeated the word Navy as they tried to piece together scattered information. Those voices told Naomi that the truth was finding its own way out despite Kane's attempts to bury or twist it. Kane, meanwhile, had no idea a rising wave was forming around him. He still believed his threats were enough to silence Naomi and crush any doubt, but the truth had slipped from his grasp the moment her nameplate was captured on video. As he barked out more accusations, someone in the crowd finally shouted, "Do you even know who she is? Or are you digging your own grave?" The outburst made a few of the officers behind Kane freeze their eyes, flickering with a trace of concern that had not existed moments earlier. Naomi forced her eyes open, her breathing still heavy but slightly deeper as she sensed the shift in the air. It was not relief, but a kind of readiness, as if her body understood something was about to happen. She faintly heard Liam's voice, closer than before, a sign of support that took courage, given the circle of uniforms around her. And though she could not turn her head, she could feel his gaze, the gaze of someone who had uncovered a truth he knew would change everything. The crowd grew louder, whispers carrying a new tension. A small detail, a nameplate, nearly forgotten under layers of prejudice and violence, had now become the center of something much larger. From that moment on, the situation slipped out of Kane's control. Everything he had tried to force Naomi to do, every threat he had thrown at her, every display of aggression meant to intimidate the crowd, was beginning to backfire. Naomi, still on the ground, did not yet know that the truth about who she was spreading through every phone and every whispered exchange, quietly building toward a shift no one, not even she, had anticipated. And as Liam stood there, his eyes fixed on the Navy emblem on her sleeve, he placed himself in a position with no way back. He knew he had to stand fully with her, for the truth, for justice, and for what was about to erupt on this once quiet street. The atmosphere shifted sharply as rumors about Naomi's identity spread, yet Kane either failed to notice or deliberately ignored the warning signs pressing in from every direction. The crowd grew thicker, phones still raised, eyes sharpened by a rising sense of injustice burning in their chests. The whispers had turned into open voices, angry and confused. Naomi was still pinned to the pavement, her breath painful, but her gaze steady. She heard her name called, heard talk of the military, heard people questioning Kane's actions, and for a brief moment she felt the subtle but powerful change in the sentiment around her. Kane was different. He cared nothing for the murmurs or the contempt aimed at him. He saw only one thing: Naomi would not submit. That fact dug into his pride like a thorn. In his mind, a black woman forced to the ground should have broken under the first threat. But Naomi still looked him in the eye, still refused to sign the confession, still refused to let him shape her fear. Her resilience pushed him toward harsher methods, as if breaking her would restore the authority slipping from his grasp. He moved closer and signaled the officer behind her to lift Naomi off the ground. But instead of letting her stand, he yanked her arms back, twisting her shoulder as if she were an object without feeling. Naomi clenched her teeth, a choked sound, leaving her as the pain forced the air from her lungs. The crowd erupted immediately, shock turning into fury at the sight of Kane wrenching her arms with no restraint. "Stop! He's breaking her arm! She isn't resisting!" Cries burst out like waves slamming against the pavement and surging toward Kane. Naomi was turned onto her side, her arms bent sharply behind her. Kane pulled so hard that her whole body tilted to keep balance under the restraint. He dragged metal cuffs from his belt, the sharp clink of steel ringing out like the signal of collapsing authority. He locked her wrists with a harsh, deliberate motion, as if the act could compensate for his failure to find evidence in her bag. Each click of the cuffs sent a fresh swell of anger through the crowd. A man at the front shouted, "She's being arrested because of her skin. Let her go." A woman filming live said, louder, We're recording everything. You're abusing your power." The air ignited like dry hay meeting flame, each shout layering over the next until the once quiet street pulsed with a chaotic roar. Kane turned his eyes filled with irritation. He hated how the crowd reacted like fire meeting wind, and he hated even more that their anger was no longer aimed at Naomi, but at him. In that moment, he shifted his rage toward the people watching his stare, slicing through them one by one. "Maintain order," he shouted, his voice echoing across the street. "Back up anyone obstructing this operation will be arrested." But the threat did nothing to calm the crowd. Instead, it fueled them. Another group of officers quickly approached when they saw the tension rise. Kane shot them a commanding look. "Control the crowd," he barked. "Keep them back." The moment the people saw the officers spreading into formation, their voices grew louder. Accusations against Kane rang out like hammer strikes on metal. "We saw everything. He's abusing his power. She didn't do anything wrong." And each time those words rose, Kane tightened the cuffs around Naomi's wrists, as if that could somehow restore the authority slipping out of his hands. Naomi was yanked to her feet, her hands locked behind her, her breath still strained but steady, thanks to the endurance she had trained for years. She looked around, seeing outrage etched onto the faces in the crowd, and hearing them call her name. Even while surrounded by guns and badges, she felt she was not entirely alone. But that same support pushed Kane to try even harder to isolate her, like a man desperate to prove that he alone defined what was right. As the officers formed a line to push the crowd back, Liam suddenly stepped into the space between them and Naomi. He raised his hands to chest level, showing he was not a threat, but his eyes were firm. "She is innocent," he said, enunciating each word. Naomi did nothing to deserve this. The air seemed to freeze. Kane stared at Liam, stunned and furious that someone dared stand between him and the person he was trying to dominate. "Move, now." Kane's voice strained like a rope about to snap. "You have no right to interfere." Liam did not move. He didn't even flinch. He stayed right where he was, shielding Naomi, his body trembling with anger, while his voice held steady. "I'm the delivery driver. I was right there when this started. You're arresting her based on prejudice, not on a single fact." The crowd erupted, cheers and agreements bouncing from both sides of the street. Someone shouted, "Let him speak." Another added, "We want the truth." Kane clenched his jaw, the veins in his hand standing out as he tightened his fist. For the first time that afternoon, his arrogance was being challenged directly. But the truth could notch Liam without triggering an even bigger explosion. Phones were raised, pointed straight at him. Eyes were locked on him, waiting for one wrong move. Every choice he made now was under the control of the community standing only a few feet away. Naomi looked at Liam from the corner of her eye, a brief light flickering in her gaze despite the pain on her face. Her breathing was strained, yet her heart steadied at his act of courage. He did not run from trouble as so many would. He stood between her and danger, knowing full well Kane could cuff him next. That moment sharpened the divide between the two sides. On one side were the people standing with truth and justice. On the other were the officers were trying to force their power onto Naomi by any means. Shouts continued behind them, mixed with the tense footsteps of the police line shifting. The divide had erupted into two clear sides, pulled tight like a string that needed only the slightest tug to snap. Naomi stood at the center of that line, her hands cuffed but her eyes stronger than ever. Kane believed he had driven her to the edge, but the moment he locked those cuffs became the shock that pushed everything beyond his control. From that point forward, the truth no longer belonged to Kane. It stood with Naomi, with the crowd, and with everyone who knew the injustice had gone too far. The air in the narrow street felt stretched to the point where a single word could make the sky collapse. Naomi stood surrounded by the three officers, her hands aching in the cuffs behind her back, her breathing still uneven after being pinned down. Yet, amid the shouting, the anger of the crowd, and the taut standoff between Liam and Kane, Naomi suddenly regained a calm that seemed impossible. It was not the calm of surrender, but the quiet certainty of someone who knew things were reaching a point her opponent could not foresee. Kane stepped closer, his hand still gripping the cuffs, his face inches from hers as if to remind her he believed he controlled the situation. "You think that delivery boy can save you," he said with disdain, "or that this crowd will make me change my mind." Naomi lifted her head, her face strained with pain, but her eyes no longer reflecting helplessness. Instead, they held clarity, sharpness, and the stillness of someone about to drop a stone into calm water. "You are arresting the wrong person," she said slowly and clearly, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "And my rank is far above the authority of any of you." The entire crowd fell silent for a beat. Some people exchanged looks, others angled their phones to capture her words more clearly. Liam, standing closest, widened his eyes because what she said aligned perfectly with what he had begun to piece together from the Navy emblem on her sleeve. Kane, however, did not react with concern. Instead, he let out a mocking laugh. It scratched through the tense air like metal dragging across glass. "You're trying to scare me," he said, raising a brow as if her words were the final struggling lie of a cornered suspect. "You think a few empty lines will change anything?" Naomi stared straight at him without blinking. "I am not scaring you," she said. "I am informing you." Kane laughed again, harsher and louder, prompting the two officers behind him to smirk amused, as if they were watching a desperate suspect grasp at one last chance. He leaned down, squeezing the cuffs as though adding one more layer of pain to her restraint. "Informing me," he repeated. "You talk like you're some sergeant, lieutenant, or whatever." Naomi replied with the slightest smile so faint it was almost invisible, yet it stirred the air around them. Higher. Silence thickened again. Many bystanders stopped recording for a moment, their eyes fixed on her. Liam could see a confidence on her face that was impossible to explain, a certainty he had never seen in any civilian being treated the way she was being treated. But while the crowd was suspended in tense anticipation, something else happened, quieter, yet far brighter than any word she had spoken. A pale blue light flashed from Naomi's belt just beneath the part of her shirt that had been pulled aside when she was forced to the ground. A thin line of light pulsed along a compact device shaped like a metal card fixed to her waistband. When Naomi was handcuffed and yanked backward, the pressure sensor inside the device activated. The glow was faint, but bright enough for those nearby to see. Within seconds, the light began blinking in a steady rhythm like a programmed alert. Liam reacted first. He bent down for a clearer look, and his face drained of color. "Kane," he said loudly, his voice cracking from fear and shock. "Do you know what that is?" But Kane was too accustomed to brushing off warnings, especially from someone he considered beneath him. "Some toy she's using to scare us," he said, jerking Naomi upright a bit so he could look at her more closely, unaware that the device's glow was reflecting in his own eyes. "No." Liam shook his head sharply. "That's a military identification device." A bystander behind him quickly added panic, trembling in their voice. "I've seen it online. It sends an automatic signal if the wearer is in danger." The words made several people turn to each other, their expressions shifting from curiosity to genuine alarm. "It belongs to high-ranking personnel," Liam continued. "Very high." Kane froze for half a second, but his ego was too large to let him believe that the woman he had just arrested, threatened, and manhandled could be military, and not just any military, but someone with authority far beyond his. He laughed again, but this time the sound lacked confidence. It was forced, strained, as if he were trying to deny a truth crashing toward him. "You think I'm falling for that trick?" he said loudly, projecting his voice toward the crowd as if volume could restore his dominance. "A blinking light doesn't change the fact she's a suspect." Naomi closed her eyes for a beat, then opened them, her gaze sharper than before. "The signal has already been sent." Her voice was tight from pain, but each word struck like metal on metal. "From this moment, you have 15 minutes. Those nearest heard her clearly, and a ripple of fear spread outward like oil across water. 15 minutes, someone whispered. She said 15 minutes, another repeated, eyes, wide phone, angled closer to Naomi's face. A young man on the right side of the street quickly typed on his phone, checking the information spreading in the viral clips. Seconds later, he looked up in shock and shouted, "If she's really special operations, that signal calls a SEAL team. They respond within 15 minutes." The words hit the street like a catalyst, shaking the entire block. The crowd no longer stood still. Some people stepped back on instinct. Others lifted their phones higher, switching from curiosity to urgent live streaming. An elderly woman on the opposite porch clasped her hands to her chest and whispered a prayer. A few kids near the corner darted their eyes around wide with a mix of fear and fascination. The atmosphere surged into a chaotic blend of worry and adrenaline, as if everyone understood they were standing at the edge of a storm they were not prepared to face. For the first time since stepping out of his patrol car, Kane lost his certainty. He stared at the blinking device on Naomi, the steady blue light reflecting across his face. He swallowed hard, trying to hide it by clenching his jaw. Silence stretched between Naomi and Kane for several seconds, a suspended ellipsis hanging between them as the approaching storm pressed closer. Naomi tilted her head just enough for her eyes to lock with his. "You can continue," she said, "but you will answer for every action you've taken to people whose rank you have no right to stand before." The words cut through Kane's pride like a thin, sharp blade. He opened his mouth to respond, but the sound was drowned out by the crowd. "Be careful," someone yelled. "If she's really special ops, the military will come." The warning swept across the scene like a rolling wave. Naomi drew a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the evening light was fading. The signal had been sent. 15 minutes were ticking, and somewhere not far away, a SEAL team was already moving, heading straight for the small street where the truth was about to flip the entire situation upside down. A silent wave was forming, subtle in the first few moments, but then rising like a violent storm that knocked everything off its usual path. The instant the signal on Naomi's belt lit up and her words began shaking the perception of everyone present, the crowd had not yet fully grasped the gravity of the situation, but social media was already several steps ahead. The video capturing Kane slamming Naomi down, twisting her arm and restraining her with clear hostility began spreading at a staggering speed. Shaky frames shouting, arguing Naomi's choked breaths on the pavement, and the flash of blue light at her waist were swallowed whole by the internet and spat back out in thousands of versions. In less than a few minutes, the incident was no longer a minor confrontation on a quiet street. It had become something far larger than the boundaries of a neighborhood. The first comments appeared confused, asking what was happening and trying to make sense of it. But as more angles surfaced, showing close-ups of Kane wrenching Naomi's arm, wide shots proving she never resisted, and clips of Liam trying to protect her, that confusion hardened into unmistakable outrage. That outrage pulsed through every sentence, every comment, every red, angry emoji. People started talking about abusive power, about racial discrimination, about a black woman being treated like a criminal despite doing nothing wrong. They questioned behaviors they had seen far too many times in real life and were now watching unfold again in a way more raw and repulsive than before. A large account reposted the video with the caption, "Unbelievable. This is still happening in this era," and within 10 minutes it gained hundreds of thousands of views. Elsewhere, a legal professional shared the clip with a quick breakdown of the violations and Kane's handling of the situation. Comment after comment poured in, pushing the video to the top of trending lists at an astonishing pace. At the same time, people unable to hold back their anger began launching a hashtag calling for justice. Justice for Naomi. At first, it appeared only in a few pockets, but no one expected it to ignite like wildfire racing across dry fields. Each passing minute brought hundreds more uses, then thousands, until it became a flood across every platform. The hashtag was no longer just a call for justice. It became a symbol of unity against an act act that the community now viewed as the peak of humiliation and injustice. Many accounts belonging to human rights groups and national media outlets began paying attention. They shared the videos, added analyses about police violence, and commented on how a black woman could be treated so brutally in broad daylight on a public street in front of dozens of witnesses. The flood of comments hit the system like a hailstorm, hammering an institution not used to facing such unified public pressure. Posts sharing Naomi's story gathered hundreds of thousands of interactions. Some journalists uncovered early information about her possible military connection, which made the situation even more serious. They questioned whether the police were steering themselves into a disastrous mistake by targeting someone far outside their authority. While social media exploded, the real street where everything happened grew crowded. Local residents heard the news from neighbors, from online posts, from friends, and rushed to the scene. A group of young people arrived carrying banners filled with messages condemning police brutality. A middle-aged woman stood near the curb, her eyes red with anger after seeing how Naomi had been treated. Others began shouting for Kane to release her. With each passing second, the crowd spread wider, spilling across both sides of the street, transforming the once narrow block into a heavy pressurized corridor. People pressed up against the police line, chanting short, sharp, furious phrases calling for justice. Phones stayed raised, broadcasting the scene to hundreds of thousands of viewers. Cries of, "Let her go. She's innocent. You're abusing your power," rose nonstop, blending with the hurried footsteps of more residents arriving. It felt as if the entire neighborhood had stepped into an unplanned battle driven by shared outrage. Kane, who had been confident and arrogant from the start, began to feel the shift with painful clarity. His voice no longer overpowered the crowd. The chants tightened his throat, and his expression shifted from anger to tension. He glanced around and saw the officers behind him beginning to look uneasy. Some whispered to each other, gripping their uniform straps or touching their radios as if seeking something solid to hold on to. Kane knew the situation was no longer under his control, the way it had been when he slammed on the brakes, stepped out of his car, and used his authority to dominate Naomi. He looked at Naomi, a flicker of confusion crossing his eyes despite his attempt to hide it. She was still standing there, hands cuffed behind her, yet her calm made everything far more unsettling for him. She had not broken down, had not begged, had not shown weakness. That alone made him feel smaller beneath the weight of the community's anger. Every gaze from the crowd, every phone pointed at him, even the eyes of his fellow officers bore down on him like a harsh light he could not escape. Liam remained in the middle, his face marked by firm resolve as he watched the crowd stand behind Naomi. He felt the surge of unity in the air, the way people instinctively came together to protect a woman suffering blatant injustice. He knew he had been right to step forward and shield her. But more than that, he realized this was only the beginning. Naomi's warning, about 15 minutes ticking by, the blinking military device, and the explosive spread of the video all made him understand that everything was building toward a moment none of them on this street could anticipate. Kane clenched his fist as someone shouted, "You're going to pay for this." The voice came from a man near the parked cars along the curb. Kane spun around to yell back, but his voice no longer carried the power it once had. In that moment, he recognized with painful clarity that the situation had crossed a line he was never prepared for. He could no longer shout the crowd into silence. He could not intimidate them one by one, and he certainly could not control the narrative the way he had when he first grabbed Naomi under the imaginary shield of unquestioned authority. Social media was erupting. Residents were flooding in. The press was about to join. The SEAL team was on its way. And Kane, whether he admitted it or not, stood on the edge of a storm that even the power he believed was absolute could no longer save him from. Once the video spread at breakneck speed and the crowd kept growing at the scene, the first shockwave hit the city's police department head-on. Alarmed calls poured in like hail during a storm. No one inside the department had expected that what seemed like a minor arrest involving a black woman standing outside her own home could erupt into a nationwide media crisis. But once the footage of Kane twisting Naomi's arm, forcing her to the ground, ignoring Liam's explanations, and displaying outright hostility reached millions online, there was no way to contain the damage. The phone in the unit commander's office rang non-stop to the point where a young officer had to sprint back and forth carrying 3 notepads at once because he could not keep up with the messages. A superior officer from Kane's chain of command called directly through the internal line, his voice hoarse from stress. By any means necessary, he growled through clenched teeth, "Reduce the media pressure. Do not let a small incident become a catastrophe." His tone was no longer the calm voice of leadership, but that of a man watching a disaster unfold right at the station doors, fully aware they might not be able to recover if things spun any further out of control. In the surveillance room where body cam data was stored, a group of officers had been ordered to urgently review Kane's footage. They opened each file, scrubbing back and forth to find anything that could salvage his actions, but everything was too clear. The shove that took Naomi down the force on her back, the shouting, the arm twisting every second, appeared on screen with no room for excuses. The weight of that truth pressed over the room like someone had stacked lead across the ceiling. One officer, his face tight with frustration, shut off the video feed and looked at the others. "Is there any way to delete this?" he asked, "or edit it?" The moment he said it, several officers exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke, but everyone knew it was pointless. A bystander had recorded the whole event, and the video was already in the hands of millions. Deleting the body cam footage now would only make them look guilty. An older officer shook his head and exhaled heavily. "If we edit anything now, it's the same as signing a confession. It's too late." The word late hung in the room like a verdict. At the workspace of Kane's unit, the chaos was even worse. Several officers traded uneasy glances, their eyes showing a mix of confusion and fear. Small arguments erupted in scattered bursts across the room. One whispered, "Are we supposed to stand with him or not?" Another snapped back, "You want to get dragged into an investigation?" A third retorted, "But he's part of our unit. If we abandon him, what happens to our team loyalty?" Each exchange grew louder, the atmosphere heating up like a pressure cooker about to explode. Many officers could not stay calm because they understood better than anyone that if the truth came out, a chain of consequences would follow, from internal investigations to possible suspensions. No one wanted to be the sacrificial piece for Kane's mistakes. A young officer considered the closest to Kane clenched his fists, his voice trembling with anger and fear. He said Naomi was a suspect. He insisted. He believes that. But his colleague shot back immediately, and now the whole city thinks he's an abuser. You want to be attached to that name. The words hit the room like a slap, waking half of them from denial. The officers stopped looking at each other and instead stared down at their desks, calculating whether defending someone who caused this explosion was worth it. Loyalty began to crack under the weight of public pressure. Before the argument could settle, the door swung open. A mid-ranking officer stepped in, pale-faced. He held up his phone, showing a notification glowing on the screen. The rumor reached the higher-ups. He said, his voice soft but so heavy that the room fell silent at once. "They're saying Naomi Brooks is a SEAL operator." One officer nearly dropped his coffee. Another shot up from his chair, and the youngest in the group stepped back as if someone had told him there was a bomb under his feet. A wave of shock swept across the room. A SEAL. Someone whispered, stunned. No one knew how accurate the rumor was, but the possibility alone was enough to make everything infinitely worse. If a SEAL operator was being abused by police in front of dozens of witnesses and hundreds of recording devices, this was no longer a neighborhood issue. It was a federal federal one, and its consequences could shake the entire system from top to bottom. An older officer placed both hands on his head, his face turning ashen. "If she really is SEAL," he said with difficulty, "we're not just dealing with public outrage, we'll be dealing with the military." Those words dropped the entire room into absolute silence. No one could say another word because the situation had already gone far beyond anything they had ever imagined. Someone whispered, "Does Kane even know?" But the answer was obvious. He didn't, or if he did, his blind confidence made him believe everything was still under his control. A sense of dread spread through the room like black smoke. One officer shakily reopened the footage from the scene scrubbing to the moment the device on Naomi lit up. The faint blue flashes were more than enough to send a chill down anyone's spine. "This is the signal," the man said, his voice cracking. "If it really went out, then the SEAL team—" He didn't need to finish. Everyone understood each other with a single look. Another wave of chaos surged through the room, bigger and harsher, not from arguing, but from fear. Some grabbed their phones and called their superiors non-stop. Some rushed to the radio for instructions, and others collapsed into their chairs as if their legs had lost all strength. None of them knew what to do next, because they had never been trained for a situation like this. When their opponent was a civilian, they knew how to maneuver. But when their opponent might be the military, someone whose rank could eclipse the authority of the entire department, every ounce of arrogance was shattered like glass hitting the floor. In the corner, the unit lieutenant gripped his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He called Kane for the third time. This time his voice was nearly a shout. "Get out of that situation now, you're dragging the whole unit into a pit." But on the other end of the line, Kane still didn't pick up. And at the scene, the 15 minutes were ticking down second by second. As chaos consumed the street under Kane's control and the outrage of the crowd rose by the minute. Many miles away, a different disturbance was unfolding inside a vast Navy base, a place where metal doors were always locked, where no one entered without proper clearance, and where every outgoing signal was monitored with the highest level of vigilance. In the secure communications room, the large wall-mounted screen suddenly flickered. A warning light shifted to red, then immediately cast thin streaks of light like electric wires snapping. Alert tones sounded in sharp, clipped bursts, not deafening but striking directly at the instincts of the guards on duty. A young soldier standing near the control panel shot up from his seat when he recognized the flashing code. He stared, hard eyes widening as the data appeared clearly on the screen, an emergency signal from a high-level operator identification device. That code didn't appear often, sometimes not for months. It belonged to a group so small that anyone working in the base had memorized their identifiers from the first day of training. It took the soldier less than 2 seconds to realize the signal with that familiar string of characters belonged to Naomi Brooks. A senior officer stepped forward, eyes fixed on the blinking code. "Verify it immediately," he said. The soldier moved so fast his fingers seemed to glide across the keys. Charts, secure data location feeds, and identification logs opened in layered windows, merging into a single stream. When the system displayed emergency signal confirmed, red priority, the room felt as if it had been stretched by an invisible force. No one spoke, but everyone understood this type of signal couldn't be ignored or delayed. It wasn't a test. It wasn't a malfunction. It was an official distress trigger from a Navy operator facing a threat severe enough to activate a priority code only a handful of personnel possessed. The duty officer didn't hesitate for even a second, immediately escalating the signal to command. Within moments, the indicator lights shifted from yellow to a fierce red, announcing that the entire rapid response system had been activated. In the central command wing, the SEAL commander was reviewing the team's training schedule when the secure line rang. He answered, listened for about 4 seconds, then bolted upright so fast his chair toppled backward. "Confirm location," he said, his voice dropping low, compressed like a brewing thunderstorm. Within seconds, Naomi's coordinates appeared on a satellite map. A single red dot sat in the middle of a residential zone where narrow streets cut between rows of homes. The commander stared at that dot the way one stares at a combat target, his expression shifting instantly from calm to razor sharp. His calm shifted to a sharp, icy focus. "Ready the rapid response team," he ordered. "Initiate Phase 1. The words cracked like a starting gun. The entire room moved at once. Lights snapped on, electronic boards lit up. Officers, no matter what they were doing, rose and rushed toward the operations zone. Information about Naomi's condition was projected onto the main screen, showing a sudden spike in physical stress just before the signal activated. It confirmed she had been forced, yanked, or pinned down hard enough for the emergency device to trigger. Anyone who had ever worked with Naomi understood she wasn't someone who activated an emergency signal unless the situation had spiraled far beyond normal danger. That fact drove the response team to move with a seriousness no one dared treat lightly. In a nearby barracks, SEAL members were called up instantly, some still half out of their training gear. They ran to the armory, each retrieving hand-selected equipment, body, armor, tactical helmets, comm gear, and tools for urban response scenarios. No one asked what happened. They simply looked at the code flashing on the screen above the armory door, and their silence said everything. It was Naomi's code. The woman who had served beside them for years, who had pulled multiple teammates back from the edge of death, who was regarded as a pillar in missions requiring composure and sharp strategy. When the deployment order officially opened, an officer read it aloud. "Emergency signal sender operator Naomi Brooks. Threat location Western Suburban Residential Zone. Risk involves local police exhibiting abusive conduct. Command directive: ensure the safety of operator Brooks, suppress any force endangering her life or authority." The words rolled through the room like thunder, each one cutting as clean as a blade into the awareness of everyone present. A young officer swallowed hard. "Suppress police," he whispered. The man beside him nodded, voice low enough to be almost unheard. "If they're acting outside the line, that's the order." No one objected. No one hesitated. To them, Naomi wasn't just a teammate. She was part of the unit that had survived the unimaginable together. They would not allow any force to demean or harm someone who belonged to them. Meanwhile, in the motor bay, engines thundered awake as armored vehicles roared on in unison. Bands of yellow light swept across the metal ceiling, casting long streaks across the concrete floor. The air thickened with the smell of hot metal and engine oil as technicians sprinted along the line of vehicles, performing final checks with the precision of people who knew a single mistake could decide the outcome of the entire mission. The massive hangar doors slid open, casting a long streak of light across the yard. The special operations team boarded the vehicles with a swift precision that commanded respect from anyone watching. Every member understood the extraordinary nature of this mission. No one knew exactly what was happening in that residential neighborhood, but the information they did have was enough for them to brace for a confrontation not with ordinary criminals, but with those who were supposed to represent the law. As the first armored vehicle rolled out of the bay, dust curled beneath its tires in thick waves like the breath of a steel beast waking from a long sleep. The convoy followed close behind, headlights cutting through the gray dusk. The engines blended into a heavy unified roar that made the ground tremble. Inside the vehicles, silence settled in, dense and controlled. No one spoke, but every pair of eyes carried the same resolve to bring Naomi back safely and to face down anyone who stood in their way. The iron gate of the base slowly closed behind them, sealing the line between preparation and action. The shift was immediate and absolute, and with the 15 minutes still ticking down the street where Naomi was handcuffed would no longer be just a chaotic scene. It was about to become the epicenter of an unprecedented clash between the military and a police force drunk on its own authority. When the Special Operations Convoy left the naval base, no one on the small barricaded street understood that a storm of steel was racing toward them fast enough to change the entire situation in a heartbeat. Naomi still stood at the center of the circle, her hands locked behind her back, her face angled slightly from the lingering pain of Kane's violent arm twist. The crowd kept growing, shouts, ringing phones, and frantic conversations blending into a chaotic symphony. But then, within that chaos, another sound rolled in from afar, deep, low, and powerful enough to silence every voice in the same instant. First came the heavy engines rumbling and steady like the heartbeat of an armored beast crawling toward them. Then came the vibration in the pavement felt through the soles of their feet, and the glass panes rattling in the windows of the houses lining the street. The crowd turned toward the far end of the road where high-mounted headlights carved a bright wedge of light across the block. A beat later, massive armored vehicles emerged through a thin haze of dust like slabs of steel forged out of a storm. When the first one pushed into the street, the noisy tension collapsed into absolute breath-stopping strain. It was no longer the tension of an argument, but the primal fear that comes when military machines take the field. The armored vehicle edged toward the curb, blocking the full width of the street like a moving wall of steel. And seconds later, at the opposite end, another vehicle appeared, sealing the last remaining exit. The entire area was locked down in moments. The crowd stepped back instinctively, needing no instruction because everyone understood these machines did not appear unless the situation had crossed every line of safety. The slow sweep of amber lights spinning atop the vehicles washed pale light across the faces nearby, freezing the air as if the temperature had dropped without warning. The steel door of the first vehicle slammed open. The metallic snap hit the crowd like a punch to the chest. A SEAL operator stepped out, posture straight, eyes sharp, one hand resting near the comms unit on his shoulder. People backed up even more, trying to clear a path for the team. No one shouted, no one argued, no one even whispered. They simply stared, stunned by the sight of a force most of them had never seen at such close range. And what unsettled them wasn't fear of the SEALs themselves. It was fear for the men who had caused something so severe that the SEALs had to show up in person. The door of the second vehicle swung open almost at the same time, then the third, then the fourth. Each one released 4 to 5 operators, all moving with astonishing precision. Their steps were powerful, quick, and synchronized as if programmed. They did not need to shout commands, but the way they formed their lines was enough for the crowd to understand they were trained to control any terrain, any threat, any level of danger. Even from a distance, people could feel the intimidation in their posture, in their eyes, in every measured movement. It was the kind of disciplined, intentional force meant for clear objectives, not the meaningless aggression Kane had shown. Kane, still trying to hold on to control, immediately knew what was happening. He heard the steel wheels, the synchronized footsteps of the operators, the fearful murmurs from his own team behind him. He turned, eyes widening by instinct. The sight of armored vehicles sealing both ends of the street drained the color from his face at first, then flushed it red with anger and panic. He had encountered military units during a few joint events, but he had never seen a SEAL team deploy fully armed into a location he was commanding. That fact alone meant something unmistakable. He had laid hands on someone he was never allowed to touch. The officers in Kane's team sensed it even faster than he did. Some stepped back on instinct, some reached toward their belts, some jolted so hard they looked around in confusion. A few older officers dropped their gaze, avoiding the SEAL's eyes, as if to silently declare they wanted no part of this. It was the fear of people who realized they had crossed a line forbidden by both the law and the military. Naomi stood in the middle of the street, her hands still locked behind her, her eyes lifting slightly as she caught the reflection of steel on the armored vehicles. She recognized the presence of the SEALs instantly, not because they were her teammates, but because she understood the military's response system better than anyone present. She knew who would be deployed once the signal went went out, who would have the authority to mobilize them, and who would lead the team out of the vehicle in an emergency. Even in cuffs and in pain, a flicker of relief crossed her eyes, but it was quickly shadowed by the worry that everything had escalated far beyond what she intended. Each SEAL moved into the center of the scene like a dense black tide. They advanced in 2 lines fast, but controlled, keeping perfect spacing between positions. They did not point weapons at anyone, but the way their hands hovered near their grips was enough to stop anyone from making a reckless move. People on both sidewalks nearly stopped breathing, many pressing their backs against the walls to avoid blocking the operator's path. Every pair of eyes followed their steps in stunned silence. And then, as the formation closed in near the area where Naomi was being held, the lead operator raised his hand. The SEAL team instantly widened their perimeter, enclosing the zone like a steel net. Their focus was locked on one single point. Not the crowd, not Liam, not the trembling residents standing behind the line. They aimed straight at Kane. Kane stepped back half a pace. He swallowed, but his throat was so dry that no sound came out. His police instincts told him this was no longer a situation he could shout through or force others to obey. This was not a patrol unit he could order around like toys. This was a force trained to fight under the worst conditions, face the most dangerous enemies, and protect their own at any cost. Liam stood beside Naomi, watching the scene with a mix of awe, fear, and relief. He knew the SEALs would come, but he had not imagined they would arrive like this. The strength of the military made the earlier chaos feel small and meaningless. Their presence extinguished every lingering argument like a cold wind snuffing out scattered sparks. Naomi exhaled slowly, her eyes lifting toward the special operators advancing toward her. It was not the gaze of someone begging for rescue. It was the gaze of someone who recognized that power had shifted, and the people who tried to crush her were about to face something they never anticipated. The SEAL team kept moving step by step until the distance between them and Kane shrank to only a few meters. And in that moment, everything on the small street fell silent enough that the soft metallic clicks on their boots could be heard as they came to a stop. A silence not of peace, but of a storm touching down. Silence covered the street like a curtain. Residents crowded along both sidewalks, but no one spoke, as if even a small sound might ignite the tension hanging in the air. The SEAL team stopped in a solid arc only a few steps from Kane. Their sharp eyes, their steady arms resting near weapon grips, and their dark armor absorbing the fading daylight created an invisible pressure that made the air feel dense enough to cut. Kane tried to hold his head high, but the half step he had retreated exposed the unease running down his spine. The officers behind him were no longer composed. One swallowed so hard his throat clicked. Another tugged lightly at his ballistic vest as if reminding himself that the fabric would not stop anything if the SEALs chose the most forceful approach. The lead operator took one more step, standing upright like a steel pillar in the center of the street. He did not yell, did not draw a weapon, did not rely on threat or posture yet. The way he stood was enough for everyone present to understand their place in this confrontation. "Release her," he said, his voice low, solid, and loud enough for Kane to hear without raising it. The short command struck with the force of a battlefield order. No one in the police line dared move. Several civilians lifted their hands to their mouths, stunned that such words were being spoken on their own street in front of hundreds of witnesses. Kane opened his mouth, forcing his voice to sound steady. "She is a suspect," he said, offering an explanation he believed sounded authoritative, though compared to the SEAL's cold restraint it came off thin and almost laughable. "We have the right to detain her. I'm just doing my job." The operator did not react. He stepped forward again, making Kane recoil by instinct. "She is a high-ranking service member," he continued. "Her emergency signal has been confirmed. You're holding a Navy special operator under threat of bodily harm. Our orders are to secure her safety and stop any abuse of authority. Release her." Kane swallowed hard. He looked toward the crowd as if searching for something to cling to, some excuse to hold on to the fragile power he believed he still had. "What signal?" he said, with a strained laugh. "A blinking light proves nothing. I don't believe she's a special special operator. People like that don't live in this neighborhood." The words landed like a slap, triggering the crowd's outrage. Someone shouted, "We saw the Navy logo." Another added, "We watched the videos. Kane, she's military." The wave of protest rose together, but the SEAL team stayed locked in place, their formation unbroken, unmoved by the noise. The SEAL commander did not take his eyes off Kane. "What you believe or don't believe is irrelevant. Our orders require us to intervene." He lifted his chin slightly, signaling for two operators beside him to move forward. "Release the cuffs." Kane let out a thin laugh, but his hand trembled slightly as he gripped the chain of the cuffs on Naomi's wrists. He tried to hold on to the last scrap of authority. "I'm not releasing her. This is my scene. You have no authority to command me." The words froze the air on the street. A civilian turned to the person beside him, eyes wide, whispering, "He's lost his mind." A police officer behind Kane couldn't help but step back twice, distancing himself as if avoiding someone dragging him toward a cliff. The SEAL commander looked at Kane with an expression that was hard to distinguish as pity or contempt. "Then you leave us no choice but to use force," he said, his voice low but as solid as steel. Kane opened his mouth to protest, but in that instant, an operator moved in from the right, knocking his hand off Naomi's shoulder with a motion so quick, precise, and clean that it allowed no resistance. Kane stumbled in surprise. The second operator stepped in immediately, after turning Naomi gently, supporting her arm to ease the pressure on her cuffed wrist. Within seconds, the two operators had the complete control of the situation. "How dare you?" Kane rasped, but his voice cracked more from fear than anger. "I'm a police officer, and she is high-ranking military," the commander shot back directly at him. "You have exceeded your authority." Naomi was lifted upright, her hands still bound but no longer crushed by Kane's grip. She drew a deep breath, her back slightly arched from pain, but her face steadier and clearer than it had been all day. Standing between two lines of operators, she no longer looked like a victim but someone who had endured to the limit and was now standing among her own. When her eyes lifted and she recognized the commander's face, a calm settled back into them. "Operator Brooks," the commander said, "we received your signal." Naomi nodded slightly. "The situation escalated too fast," she replied, her voice hoarse but firm. "They threatened civilians and used excessive force. We'll handle it," the commander said, turning toward Kane. In that moment, Kane understood that everything was over. No more shouting could save him. No more intimidation could make civilians fear him. No illusion of authority could prop him up on this street ever again. A SEAL operator stepped forward and grabbed Kane's wrist. He jerked back by instinct, but was immediately restrained with a technique that sent pain shooting up his arm and forced him to his knees. In only two swift, clean movements, he was pinned against a concrete wall. The metallic click of handcuffs locking shut rang out in the suffocating silence of the entire street. The crowd almost simultaneously lifted their phones, recording the moment they knew they would remember for years. No one screamed. No one cheered right away. The silence wasn't fear, but awe, because they were witnessing something they believed only happened in movies: the military subduing a police officer on the spot for abuse of power. Kane lowered his head, breath ragged, his face burning red with humiliation. The crowd didn't laugh or jeer, but looked at him with the gaze of people who had just seen the truth peeled back to its bare roots. He was no longer the officer in control. He was nothing more than a violator being taken away in front of the very community he had always looked down on. Meanwhile, Naomi stood in the middle of the operators, her hands still cuffed, but her chin lifted, her eyes calm and strong, like someone who had just reclaimed her right to exist in a society where she had always had to fight to be seen as human. And in that very moment, the small street was changed forever. The people would remember this day not as a day of chaos, but as the day justice found its way, even if it had to push through handcuffs, shouts, and the dust kicked up by armored vehicles to reach the place where it truly belonged. After Kane was subdued and handcuffed in front of the crowd, the SEAL team immediately moved to the next step of their protocol, verifying and collecting evidence to clarify the entire incident. The murmurs of the onlookers grew as they watched the military force begin inspecting the officers' equipment. Every eye followed each movement with a mix of tension and anticipation, as if they already knew there were darker truths hidden beneath the surface of police authority. A SEAL operator signaled for two others to escort Kane aside, creating space for the military tech unit to access his body-worn camera and those of the other officers. The device was removed from his uniform in a heavy silence. Kane tried to jerk away but was held firmly, his protests swallowed by the clicks of machinery as the technicians began extracting data. Naomi stood not far away, her hands still cuffed because verification procedures had to be completed, but her eyes showed unmistakable vigilance. Even with the SEALs protecting her, she understood that everything needed to be clarified properly step by step, so no one could claim she escaped responsibility because of her position. The handheld monitor lit up, displaying a list of recordings from Kane's body cam. The SEAL commander stared at the screen while the technician quickly skimmed the initial clips. Some files showed signs of manipulation, mismatched durations, or timestamps that had been tampered with. The commander's brow furrowed, his voice tightening as he ordered a deeper check. Military software opened the raw data layers beneath each line of code, appearing like cold, undeniable evidence. Several segments had been deliberately altered. The crowd began to murmur again. They couldn't see the screen, but the solemn look on the SEALs' faces told them everything was turning toward what they had suspected from the start. A technician spoke with calm but cutting precision. "There's splicing." Multiple segments were edited to distort the actual events. The statement rippled through the crowd like an electric jolt. Some people raised their phones even higher, recording every moment of the unfolding exposure. Meanwhile, the SEAL team asked the surrounding residents to submit the videos they had recorded. Dozens of hands extended their phones toward them. A military officer took each device, quickly transferring the data into the verification system. When the first video was played on the large screen temporarily set on top of an armored vehicle, the entire street seemed to hold its breath. It began with Naomi standing at her doorstep receiving the delivery bag from Liam. Everything was completely normal with no sign of wrongdoing. Next came the moment Kane slammed his brakes, stepped out aggressively, and immediately treated Naomi like a suspect without offering any reasonable explanation. When the footage of Kane shoving Naomi to the ground appeared, the crowd erupted in outrage. Someone shouted that this part had been erased from the body cam footage the police had just presented. The video continued capturing Kane and another officer pinning Naomi against the pavement with brutal force. His derogatory remarks about her skin color were so clear they needed no audio enhancement. The SEAL commander looked at Kane, his gaze sharp like a blade left under the sun. The excuses Kane had tried to hide behind suddenly looked pathetically exposed. He stammered objections, claiming the civilian video was inaccurate and edited, but his voice shook like someone losing balance at the edge of a cliff. A SEAL operator then compared the civilian footage with the raw data from the body cam, placing them side by side. The body cam footage had been trimmed down to a few harmless fragments. Meanwhile, the civilian recording was full, clear, coherent, and complete. The two frames could not match in any way. The truth revealed itself in a form that could not be denied. The entire incident had been deliberately distorted to push Naomi into a crime she had no part in. While Kane stood struggling in his cuffed stance, Liam stepped forward, his voice ringing clearly through hundreds of watching eyes. "I'm the delivery driver," he said, his hands clenched in tension. "That was a legitimate package. I saw everything from the beginning until she was restrained. She didn't do anything wrong." Several people in the crowd nodded in support, and the SEAL team acknowledged him with visible regard. A SEAL operative recorded his statement into the report report, confirming every detail matched the video. Naomi stood a few steps away, her eyes softening slightly as she heard Liam speak. In that moment, she realized the truth would be exposed not only through military authority, but through the courage of ordinary people willing to step forward and bear witness. When all the data had been cross-checked, the SEAL commander turned back toward Naomi. He signaled for a team member to step forward and remove her cuffs. The metallic click that opened them echoed like the final punctuation to the string of absurd accusations she had been bound to for hours. As her wrists returned to freedom, Naomi flexed her fingers slightly to feel the lingering sting, but her eyes had regained their clarity, strength, and resolve, just as they had when she faced Kane at the start of everything. The crowd applauded at first in scattered bursts, then in a unified roar that filled the entire street. In the minutes that followed, as the SEAL team formally logged the video's testimonies and technical data, every charge against Naomi was dismissed as quickly as they had been fabricated. The case Kane had tried to build collapsed completely, leaving behind in the dust, cleared by the truth stains he and the system he represented could never deny. Kane dropped to his knees, his face contorted as he realized there was no path left that could pull him out of the truth now laid bare. Every gaze fixed on him carried no fear anymore, only the contempt of people he had long treated as beneath him. In those brief minutes, justice found its way back to where it belonged. Naomi stood tall within the circle of special operators, speaking no declaration yet. Her very presence in the moment truth came into the light was enough to show that every lie, every corrupt ounce of power has an end. And Kane had struck that end exactly. Right after the truth was revealed, the SEAL team immediately tightened their perimeter and placed the entire scene under military authority. The local police officers who had been scattered across various positions were ordered to step away from the central processing area, surrendering all command to the Special Operations Unit. No one protested. No one dared. A few officers even lowered their heads to avoid the SEAL's eyes, as if trying to distance themselves from Kane's actions, fearing they would be tied to something they neither controlled nor had the courage to stop. The air thickened with silence, but it was the silence of collapse, the silence of a power structure crushed beneath the very evidence it had tried to hide. Naomi stood at the center of the protective formation, her wrists still red and marked from the cuffs that had pinched too tightly, but her posture had changed entirely. When the special operator stepped forward and gently removed the final cuff from her wrist, the metallic release sounded louder than any noise before it. The return of her freedom wasn't simple relief, but a declaration that truth had won a crucial battle in the fight she had been forced into solely because of the color of her skin. A SEAL steadied her arm to examine the injury. His eyes held respect, professionalism, and responsibility. There was no condescension, no pity, only the regard reserved for an equal, someone worthy of full dignity. Naomi nodded, thanking him with a voice still hoarse after hours of being forced against the ground. The SEAL commander signaled for the formation to part on both sides, creating a wide path to escort her out of the danger zone. She walked between two lines of operators, while hundreds of residents crowded both sides of the street. No one spoke, but their silence was heavier and more reverent than applause. They looked at her as someone who had stood firm inside a storm, a symbol of resilience in the face of injustice. Kane, meanwhile, was held on the opposite side, his face angled toward the pavement. Two special operators restrained him, holding one arm each, with a third walking behind to ensure he wouldn't act out. Kane had shouted earlier, trying to salvage some last fragment of authority, but his voice faded like static from a broken speaker. He was escorted away under strict military protocol, every step controlled by steady hands that allowed no argument or resistance. Moments earlier, he had been the one making all the decisions on this street. Yet, now, the very street, the very people he once lorded over, were watching him like a man whose true nature had been peeled back for all to see. The police uniform he had worn with pride for years now looked meaningless, like a cheap costume stripped from a stage. No one feared him anymore. No one even regarded him as a keeper of the law. He was simply the man who had shattered its integrity with his own bitterness. As the SEAL team escorted Kane through the most crowded stretch of the street murmurs rose into a wave of voices. Then, from somewhere within the crowd, a single person clapped. Another followed. Within seconds, the entire street erupted in applause like waves rising after a violent storm. Someone shouted that Naomi deserved respect. Another said Kane had to face the consequences of what he had done. No one was cheering for violence. They were cheering for justice, for the truth that had finally been proven after hours of being threatened by twisted authority. The applause was still rising when Naomi was taken to a safer area behind an armored vehicle. She turned back toward the street, taking in the faces of the people who had witnessed the entire confrontation. Those faces carried relief, gratitude, and a rekindled trust. Naomi didn't smile, but her eyes softened for a moment. She didn't need to say anything for the crowd to understand that they were part of the reason justice had been able to break through today. No one walked away immediately. They stood there as if wanting to carve the image into memory, as if reminding one another that there are days when justice must be reclaimed through the courage of those who stand and watch. As for Kane, every step he was pushed toward the transport vehicle stripped away another layer of the arrogance he once clung to. No longer able to shout, no longer able to bark orders at anyone, he was forced into silence as the SEALs shoved him into the armored compartment. When the steel door slammed shut, the heavy clang sounded like the final punctuation mark on the chaos he had created. The crowd cheered when the door closed. Their cheers weren't to humiliate him, but to affirm that actions like his would no longer have a place in a community willing to protect one another. In that moment, the small street was no longer a place smothered by oppression, but a stage where justice had briefly been restored. Naomi was escorted toward a military vehicle under strict protection, while Kane was taken away in the humiliation he had inflicted on others for years. And, in the eyes of the witnesses, the shift in power was not just a dramatic turn in the story, but a powerful reminder that no authority is great enough to bury the truth forever. Justice may arrive late, but when it comes, it can make an entire street erupt, as if discovering its own strength for the first time. When Kane was removed from the scene and Naomi taken to safety, the SEAL team moved on to the next step in clarifying the incident, verifying the contents of the black delivery bag, the very thing Kane had used as the foundation for the fabricated accusations that placed Naomi in the role of a suspect. The bag was transferred directly into a temporary security room set up beside an armored vehicle where the military tech unit and 2 senior officers monitored every step to ensure the process followed protocol and left no room for tampering. The room was thick with concentration. Only personnel with clearance were allowed near the examination table. Naomi was invited inside as a directly involved party, while Liam stood outside with a SEAL officer ready to provide confirmation. The black bag sat on the steel table, solid, and neatly shaped, its seal intact, exactly as it had been when Liam handed it to Naomi before everything erupted. The white overhead lights made the dark fabric look even sharper, like a piece of evidence waiting to be cleared. When the military technician gently unzipped the bag, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Inside was nothing suspicious, nothing remotely resembling the fabricated narrative Kane had forced onto the situation. Instead lay a thick layer of protective padding, and beneath it a military-grade device sealed in a metal case with a clear identification code, along with a sealed envelope resting above it. The device was lifted out carefully and placed on the table. Naomi recognized it immediately as an upgraded naval routing unit used in specialized communication systems. Not only was it fully legal, but it was also a newly issued model shipped strictly between authorized military divisions. The technician opened the envelope. Inside was a complete set of documents, proof of origin, order, number, transport, authorization, and the designated recipient. On the first page, the name Naomi Brooks was printed clearly above her service ID. The SEAL commander took the file, reviewed each page, then looked back at Naomi with confirmation in his eyes. The device is Navy property ordered and approved by the Communications Center. You are the assigned recipient according to protocol," he said, each word stripping away another layer of the false narrative Kane had tried to build. Another military officer compared the shipment code in the documents with the code engraved on the device housing. Every detail matched perfectly. There was no sign of substitution, editing, or forgery. Every piece of information, every signature stood as irrefutable proof that Kane's accusations were nothing more than prejudice and abuse of authority. Liam was then called in. He stepped inside, his hands still trembling faintly after the long, exhausting ordeal, but his voice steady as he said, "I picked up the package from the warehouse, signed for it, and delivered it directly to Naomi Brooks. I checked the shipment code, the sender's signature, and everything was legitimate. She didn't hide anything or act suspicious in any way." The SEAL commander recorded the testimony, added it to the cross-check file, then instructed the technician to replay the surveillance footage from the pickup zone where Liam collected the package. Everything matched his statement. Another line of evidence was added to the chain of truth now taking shape. Naomi stood still, her wrists lightly bandaged where the cuffs had cut into her eyes dimming for a moment as she considered how a legitimate package had subjected her to a string of humiliating action. Even so, she held the composed demeanor of someone trained in a military environment, refusing to let emotion override reason or allow anger to derail the focus of clearing her name. Outside the security room, the crowd remained gathered. They could not see the screen directly, but they watched the SEAL officers shake their heads, then exchange looks of surprise and frustration. Quiet murmurs rippled outward like small waves. They understood that the bag the excuse Kane had used to trample Naomi had been proven completely transparent, and, with the truth of it exposed, the entire structure of accusations he had built began to collapse. Once the SEAL team finished the verification, the commander decided to contact the Central Police Headquarters to report the situation. The call was so serious that even those standing nearby instinctively held their breath. "The device in the package is military property transported legally and fully authorized," he said. "All related accusations have no basis. We request that the local police department immediately cease internal directives regarding this incident and transfer full authority of handling to the military until a complete report is finalized." On the other end, the department could not object. They had already suffered a severe shock from the public backlash the viral footage and the misconduct laid bare. And now, the bag, the only anchor Kane had used to fabricate his narrative, had become evidence against him. The downfall unfolded so quickly that the department felt swallowed by a storm they could not outrun. The news circulated, leaving the remaining officers rattled. Some, who had stood close to Kane, quickly distanced themselves, while others sighed, knowing the system they worked within would be questioned for a long time after this. The SEAL report concluded with a definitive statement. There is no indication of any violation connected to Naomi Brooks. And with that, the last remnants of doubt evaporated like smoke. Outside, the street erupted in spontaneous applause when the update spread. People understood that it not only cleared Naomi, but struck directly at the abuse of authority they had feared for years. As Naomi stepped out of the security room, she paused at the doorway, drawing a deep breath. She knew this was not the end. But she also knew that the black bag, once treated as proof of wrongdoing, had become a symbol of truth, a truth that could not be twisted by prejudice or corrupt power. And behind her, the police department truly fell into crisis, with nowhere left to hide now that every layer of disguise had been ripped away. People took to the streets not to riot, but to show unity in the face of injustice. Across the city's major avenues, signs were lifted high with the words, "Justice for Naomi," "End abuse of power, no one is above the law." The voices of thousands blended into a force like a great current crashing against the long-standing wall of silence and indifference. Many communities organized public forums inviting people who had experienced similar situations to share their stories. Though the content was heavy, the atmosphere was filled with solidarity and a hunger for change. At the government level, many local council members were forced to speak out under public pressure. Some supported the call for an investigation, while others proposed temporarily suspending several officers involved in the incident. Emergency meetings were held one after another at City Hall to address the rapidly spreading crisis of trust. More and more voices demanded a complete reform of the local police force, not just in staffing but in policy oversight of authority and training methods to eliminate racist mindsets. Discussions stretched late into the night, yet no one seemed willing to leave the chamber, knowing that change would only come if they persisted to the end. On the streets and coffee shops, at schools and workplaces, Naomi's story became the biggest topic. Instead of merely expressing anger, people began to admire her calmness and strength when facing oppression. She was spoken of as a symbol of how a person can stand tall when pushed to the edge, as proof that sometimes a single voice is enough to clear a path for thousands more to follow. Alongside that, Liam's story, an ordinary delivery worker who chose to step up and testify, also became a source of inspiration, showing that one small act of courage at the right moment can change the course of an entire event. All of these elements merged into a surge of momentum, unlike anything the city had seen in years. It was not a sudden wave, but a voice built from the past, from cases long buried in filing cabinets, from the lingering wounds many people carried inside. Now that the truth about Naomi had come to light, the public understood this was not an isolated incident, but a symbol of something much deeper. They did not want the story to end with Kane's arrest. They wanted real change from the roots to the surface. With that spirit, the pressure to reform the local police force became the unified call of the entire city. It was no longer a polite request, but a powerful demand repeated in meetings and public addresses by human rights groups and among the crowds gathered in the central square. A city once accustomed to indifference was now awakened, united in a shared goal to build a fair system where power is held accountable, where skin color is not treated as a crime, and where people like Naomi never have to endure such pain again. After the chaos at the scene had settled and the SEAL team completed their internal report, Naomi was brought to a temporary restroom inside the security station. There were no more screams, no more flashing phone cameras, no crowded masses fighting for every inch just to witness her being mistreated or rescued, no overwhelming presence of armored vehicles filling the block. It was only her and the quiet stretching across the small room with its steel table, a few chairs pushed against the wall, and the cold white light reflecting off the floor like a long, pale streak. In that rare moment of stillness, Naomi sat down at her hands resting on her thighs, eyes closing gently, as if she had finally let go after a battle far beyond what her body should have endured. The silence seemed to help her breathe normally again, but soon it became a mirror reflecting memories she had buried for years. She remembered the time she was stopped for ID checks without reason while passing through crowded districts. The scrutinizing looks from strangers on the train as though they were trying to decide whether she was trustworthy. The whispers in the base parking lot, where a few younger officers muttered that she was promoted quickly because they wanted to diversify the force. None of those moments left visible wounds, but they carved deep grooves of exhaustion into her mind. Today, when Kane pinned her to the ground, twisted her arms behind her back, and used demeaning words, she did not just feel the physical pain. She felt that chillingly familiar sense of contempt she had faced so many times. But unlike the past, this time it was exposed before the entire city under the cameras of hundreds of witnesses, and the weight of it made her chest tighten when she thought about it. She opened her eyes and looked down at her wrists where bruises had begun to spread. Painful, but not what burdened her the most. The real pain came from the realization that even after earning recognition, fighting tirelessly in the military, giving everything she had for her country in the eyes of some people, her skin color was still the only crime they needed to judge her entirely. The thought created a small crease between her brows. She had faced enemies in combat zones, stepped into places where one wrong move could cost her life, yet she had never felt this tired. Fighting external enemies was far easier than fighting the prejudices rooted deep within society, where the enemy carried no gun but wielded a gaze that could crush a person's dignity at any moment. The door opened softly. A resident stepped inside holding a paper bag. She was an older woman with a gentle face and eyes still wet from what she had witnessed. She didn't speak loudly, but every word carried a quiet sincerity. "You're very strong. The whole neighborhood so you stand firm against something most people would run from." She set the paper bag on the table, saying it held some water and warm towels. Then she touched Naomi's shoulder lightly, as if offering an apology on behalf of all the things society had forced her to endure. When the woman left, a group of young people came in, placing a small card in front of her with the words, "Thank you for not bowing." They told her that the video of her had made them realize the injustice around them and that they wanted her to know she wasn't alone. Their words tightened Naomi's throat with emotion. The people outside that street had seen her beaten down and lifted back up, and now they came because they wanted to repay in some small way the pain she had endured. A moment later, the SEAL team entered, not with the tense urgency they had when subduing Kane, but with the quiet warmth of teammates checking on someone in their ranks. The commander looked at her, his eyes full of concern. "Brooks, the initial medical report says you're stable, but your mental state is what matters most. We want you to know that what you faced today was not a personal failing, but the result of a system that needs to change." Another operator placed a hand on her shoulder, the pressure light but steady, like he was lending her the strength they always shared in their hardest moments. "You've endured too much, but you're not alone," the commander continued. "We are here for you and for anyone who's treated unjustly, not just because a military signal required us to respond, but because you deserve protection." Naomi looked at each face around her, the people who had rushed into the street just because a device on her belt had sent out a distress signal. A wave of gratitude rose within her like warm surf. She leaned back in the chair, taking a deep breath, feeling their words soothe parts of her she had carried in silence for years. Today she had stood alone while being humiliated, but she didn't end the day alone. The community had stood with her, her teammates had come to protect her, and the entire city was speaking up for justice on her behalf. The constant loneliness she had carried since her early days in the military suddenly felt lighter, replaced by the sense that behind her were not only the SEALs but thousands of people willing to see her as a whole human being, not through the lens of her skin color. In the temporary calm of the small room, Naomi understood that today's pain would linger for a long time, but along with it was the dignity she had held on to even when it had been crushed to the point she thought she might not stand again. And that made her realize that no matter how difficult the road ahead would be, she had not lost. She had stood firm, and the world was finally listening. Kane's trial took place nearly a month after the incident inside a federal courthouse under strict supervision. From early morning, long lines of residents stood outside the gates holding signs demanding transparency and justice. They weren't there out of curiosity, but because they wanted to witness the moment justice was placed on the table and those who had abused it were finally held accountable. The air outside the courthouse was thick with anticipation, as if the entire city was holding its breath before the decisive hour. Inside the courtroom, reporters filled every seat, pens poised. When Kane was brought in, the overhead lights hid his pale, rigid face. Without his uniform, without the badge pinned to his chest, he stood there in an orange jumpsuit, wrists cuffed, flanked by 2 federal officers. The arrogance that once shielded him like armor had vanished, revealing a hollow fear in every nervous glance. Kane avoided everyone's eyes, but the heavy silence told him there was nowhere left to hide. The prosecutor began by showing the video recorded by bystanders, capturing the entire incident. When the footage of Kane shoving Naomi to the ground appeared, a ripple of murmurs spread across the room. When he pinned her down with his knee, a few people in the back covered their mouths, unable to believe such an act had unfolded in broad daylight before the whole community. The body cam segments that had been edited were then played side by side with the uncut civilian footage, exposing each second of manipulation. These pieces of evidence not only incriminated Kane, but also revealed his deliberate attempt to fabricate a false charge against Naomi. Testimonies from military technicians, data analysts, and SEAL operatives were presented with uncompromising precision. They detailed how Kane tampered with procedure, ignored every safety protocol, and abused his authority against a civilian without any legal basis. Liam was called to the witness stand. He stood straight, steady, yet slightly tense, as it was his first time testifying in a courtroom of this scale. The prosecutor asked questions, and he answered each one clearly. When he was asked to describe the moment Kane pushed Naomi, he swallowed and said, "I saw clearly that she wasn't resisting. I saw clearly that he wanted to charge her no matter what." His words rang out without malice or emotion, but carried a stark truth. The defense tried to pivot, pressing him with questions meant to make him doubt his memory, but he held firm, and their strategy collapsed quickly. When it came time for his own defense, Kane tried to spin a story about a difficult childhood, about a father who had once been attacked by a black man, claiming the incident made him sensitive to situations like this. He attempted to portray himself as a victim of his past, someone who only wanted to protect the community. But the judge looked at him with an expression that rejected any argument built on blame. "Your past never justifies abuse of power," the judge said, each word hard as steel cutting through the courtroom. "You do not have the right to use your own pain to inflict pain on an innocent person, and you certainly do not have the right to use someone's skin color to determine how the law is applied." The words made Kane freeze, and in that moment every attempt to blame circumstances collapsed completely. When the closing arguments ended, the judge took time to read through the entire file, reviewing the evidence before returning to the bench. The courtroom grew so quiet that the sound of pages turning was audible. Every gaze lifted, waiting. Then, in a firm voice, the judge delivered the verdict. Defendant Daniel Kane is found guilty of severe abuse of power, intentional fabrication of evidence, obstruction of justice, and racially motivated misconduct while on duty. The room fell silent. No one breathed. The court sentences you to 8 years in federal prison, revokes all positions and benefits tied to law enforcement, and permanently bars you from serving in any law enforcement agency. This time, whispers rose, but they were sighs of relief, soft taps on benches from those witnessing the moment. Kane dropped his head, shoulders shaken as the weight of the sentence crushed him. 2 federal officers stepped forward, placed their hands on his shoulders, and led him away under the eyes of hundreds. When the courtroom doors closed behind him, the air seemed to release the tension it had carried for so long. The judge then turned to Naomi, who had been invited to sit in the front row. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his voice much gentler than when he delivered the sentence, "this court acknowledges your courage, your composure, and your resolve throughout this ordeal." He stood an uncommon gesture in a hearing like this. "Your honor is fully restored, and I hope everyone present today remembers that the law exists to protect every citizen regardless of skin color or status." Naomi didn't say anything in that moment. She simply nodded, feeling a warmth rise from her chest to her throat. It wasn't because she was being praised, but because the silence she had been forced to swallow that day on the street had finally been answered with a firm affirmation from justice itself. People stood, some stepping forward to shake her hand, thanking her for her strength, for refusing to be crushed by injustice, for becoming the voice they could believe in. The applause that followed wasn't loud like the cheers on the street the day she was rescued, but it was deeper and far more moving. It was acknowledgement, admiration, the way society said she deserved to stand in the light. When Naomi stepped out of the courthouse, the last sunlight of the day fell across her face, making her eyes look brighter, calmer. She wasn't seeking praise, but she knew she had regained the most important things: her dignity, her faith in the law, and her freedom from the filthy accusations Kane had tried to bind her with. And on the courthouse steps, surrounded by people coming to congratulate her, Naomi stood taller than ever, carrying with her a truth that had been protected by every ounce of strength and courage a person could possess. The ceremony, marking the close of the case, was held in the central square, the same place where just weeks earlier people had lifted signs protesting the abuse of power. Today, those same individuals gathered again, not to protest or call for help, but to hear Naomi, who had walked through the storm in a way no one in the city could forget, deliver her final words before the story officially came to an end. On the small stage set up near the city memorial, her face was lit by the afternoon sun, carrying both the fatigue of long-lasting turmoil and a strength that words could barely capture. When Naomi stepped up to the podium, the crowd fell silent as if 100 breaths were being held at once. She looked down at her hands where the bruises had faded from deep purple to pale yellow, then raised her head, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "Justice," she began, her voice steady and low, "never comes to us on its own unless we are willing to stand up and demand it." The words, carried through the speakers, landed on every face below. Injustice doesn't end in silence. If everyone had turned away that day, or if no one had raised a phone to record the truth, I might have become someone society misunderstood forever. Justice has value only when it becomes the shared voice of people who refuse to be afraid. Heads nodded, and a few eyes shimmered with emotion. Naomi paused, then turned toward Liam standing in the front row. His face still held its familiar shyness, his hands shoved into his pockets as if he had no idea what to do under hundreds of watching eyes. Naomi offered a small smile and continued, "And I want to say this, not everyone has the military standing behind them as I did, but anyone can choose to do the right thing just as Liam did." Hearing his name spoken made him freeze, eyes widening. He had no special training, no authority, but he had a conscience. In the moments when Kane threatened him, he still stepped forward and told the truth, and that saved me. The entire square erupted in applause. Liam bowed his head, his face flushed red, but the smile he wore showed a pride he had never allowed himself before. Naomi looked again at the sea of people before her, families with small children. Older residents, young people who had once lifted signs saying justice for Naomi, and those who had witnessed the truth through their phone screens and felt compelled to take to the streets. "What made me strong wasn't weapons or rank," she said clearly. "What kept me standing was knowing I wasn't alone. You stood with me. You didn't turn away from injustice happening right in front of you. You chose to speak up." The crowd roared in response, their voices rising as if her words had struck something deep within them. Her voice then lowered, but the lower it fell, the sharper it became, like a blade slicing through society's habit of indifference. "Silence," she said, "can sometimes be more cruel than prejudice. It allows the wrong to keep being wrong. It allows victims to be misunderstood. It allows society to believe injustice is normal." The words made the entire square fall still. No wind, no murmurs. Naomi drew a slow breath and concluded, "If we want to build a better community, then silence can no longer be an option." As she stepped down from the podium, a long line of people approached to shake her hand. An elderly man with snow-white hair said he had witnessed too many abuses of power in his lifetime and felt for the first time that the truth had been placed where it belonged. A group of students said they were forming a small organization to raise awareness about racial discrimination on campus. Naomi's neighbors hugged her and told her that from now on they would stand with one another. That sense of unity was no longer a slogan, but a concrete action they formed. Community groups established a hotline to report cases of mistreatment and organized sharing sessions for people who had suffered injustice, to tell their stories. Liam stood beside Naomi as the ceremony neared its end. The two of them stood along the edge of the square, watching clusters of people talk, watching children run around beneath a sky washed in fading sunlight and filled with hope. "Do you think things will really change?" Liam asked, his voice still a bit shaky, but his eyes full of hope. Naomi looked at him, then at the crowd where laughter mixed with serious conversations. "I think today is a beginning," she said. "A step to remind everyone that the truth doesn't appear on its own. It only exists when we protect it together." Liam nodded, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, Liam, and you did something not everyone has the courage to do." He said nothing more, but his shoulders loosened as if her words had lifted a weight he had carried quietly for far too long. As the sunset cast gold across the square, Naomi walked slowly through the crowd. Her face was calm, but her eyes shone with a renewed sense of faith. Her fight was not over, but she knew she no longer walked alone. The city had changed. Its people had awakened. And her story, the story that began with a harmless black bag, twisted into a pretext for abuse, had become a reminder to thousands that justice exists only when people are brave enough to defend it. In the light breeze, with lingering conversations and fading applause, Naomi's story closed not with anger, but with the very things she had fought to reclaim: respect, courage, and faith in a society where every person has the right to stand tall in the open light. In the end, when all the turmoil had settled, the story of Naomi Brooks emerged as a journey testing the faith and dignity of a woman pushed into darkness by prejudice and distorted power. From what should have been an ordinary delivery, she suddenly became the target for Officer Kane's anger, suspicion, and fabricated accusations born from his own bitterness. Through the long hours of being pinned down under the cold eyes of those who were supposed to protect the community, Naomi held on to her calm and her determination. That was what kept her steady against humiliation, even as her honor was threatened and her safety stripped away simply because of her skin color. Thanks to the brief flash from the military device she carried, Naomi's SEAL identity slowly came to light. It shook the community awake, making witnesses realize that the true horror was never in the black bag, but in the way a human being was treated. When the SEAL teams arrived to protect her, the entire city saw a clear reversal of power. The police were no longer the oppressors. They became those forced to answer to justice. And Kane, who once believed himself the center of authority, had to bow before a truth he could no longer deny. The trial that followed confirmed every act of abuse and prejudice Kane had inflicted on Naomi. The sentence he received was not only personal punishment, but also a warning to institutions of power that any misuse leaves traces and will be exposed when people are determined to defend justice. And for Naomi, having her honor restored was not an ending, but a new beginning, and where she understood more deeply the value of voice, of courage, and of the unity within a community. This story reminds us that justice does not exist on its own. It lives through people who dare to stand up and speak the truth when it is hardest to do so. Someone like Liam, though not a hero, still became a beam of light guiding the way to the truth. The people who stood around Naomi that day also helped preserve a crucial moment so the world could see a glimpse of the injustice that many others continue to endure in silence. The greatest lesson from Naomi's story is that strength lies in resolve and dignity. Silence is sometimes the wall that allows wrongdoing to grow, but even a small voice can create great change if it rises at the right moment. A community becomes strong when it protects one another, and society becomes more just when individuals choose to place truth above fear. Naomi did that, and her story becomes a reminder that anyone can be a light against injustice simply by standing up and saying they will not accept wrongdoing happening before their eyes.